everybody, and welcome to Barn Star Sampler Block of the Month. This month we are working on block number 1, which is here, and you can just see a little bit of it up here. So this is another one of the big blocks, one of the 24-inch blocks, and it is not fat quarter friendly. So as we go through the cutting, if you wanted to make both of your blocks the exact same, you will need more than a fat quarter for a couple of these fabrics. So I have done the math and I can tell you which ones you need. Now this block itself is, there's a lot of piecing in it, so this is the only block we're doing this month. So let's get started on those fabric requirements. So I am actually making a couple of changes to the fabric requirements on this. I don't think that this fabric, the one she is calling the Aqua Floral, actually has enough contrast. You can't really see that in the block. So I'm completely changing that fabric to something that's a little more bright. So what I'm starting out with here, I am using white as my background, and then the dark indigo. If you wanted to use fat quarters, you're going to need a couple of fat quarters for this one. I happen to have yardage, so I'm just using yardage and using the same. Or if you wanted to change up your blocks a little bit, you could use 2 different fat quarters. For the green fabric number 12, I am using this lime, and I've got bits and pieces of it, but I have, and I don't have quite enough to do both. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch it up, and one of my blocks is going to have the green contrast, and the other one I'm going to use this cute little peach. So if you wanted them to be all the same color, you would need a fat quarter, and it would have to be cut very, very carefully because you would use up the entire fat quarter. If your fat quarter was out a little bit, you're not going to have enough. So what I'm going to do is split the difference, and I'm going to use this one, and I'm going to use this one for one of the blocks. And then the Aqua Floral, again, I don't believe that it stands out enough on the block. That's this little piece right here, and I think it could use a little bit more contrast. So I'm completely changing that up, and I'm going to put this goldy peach color in there. And then on the, oh, and in that case, I mean, a fat quarter works perfectly for that one. You don't need any more than that, just 1 fat quarter. For the indigo floral, I'm going to split that up, and I'm going to use 2 different indigo florals. You can get away with a fat quarter. For here, again, the cutting's a little bit squeaky, but you can get away with a fat quarter. But I just thought I'd like to switch it up, and since I'm doing 2 different of these, I'm going to do 2 different of these. And then finally, my last aqua print is going to be this also cute little guy with a little bit of a peachy fleck in it. So those are the fabrics that I'm going to use. And I do believe this is the first time in the process where I'm actually making 2 different, I mean, the block piecing and everything is going to be exactly the same. I'm just using 2 different fabrics. So we need to be a little more careful that we don't get them mixed up. So gather whatever fabrics you want to use, and let's get started with that cutting. Okay, so I am going to be starting with my background. And to start with the background, we need 3 width of fabric strips that are 3 inches wide. We basically just really need 2.4, but you don't cut 0.4 of a strip. So we go ahead and we cut 3 3-inch strips, and then we will subcut that after we get all the strips done. So 3 of those. And then there's a lot of 2.5-inch strips. We need a total of 9 2.5-inch times width of fabric. So we'll grab those next. Now this is a really pretty white fabric called Canvas by Lori Holt. And I like it a lot. So I bought like a whole lot of it, way more than I need. And sometimes that makes it a little bit more difficult to deal with because I have quite a bit of fabric hanging off my cutting table onto the floor. But because of the way I have my camera stand, so that you can see what I'm doing, the fabric is wrapped around the supports that hold the camera. So it makes it for a little bit awkward. There's 5, but worth it. It just means that I have to stop and reconfigure my fabric once I run out of table length there. There we go. Now, if you do have to stop and reconfigure your fabric, double check to make sure that you're still lined up perfectly on the edge. You should be, but if not, just recut your edge. There we go. Okay, that's 9 2.5s. Plop those into a pile. We'll cut them up in a bit. And we also need a 4.5 inch times width of fabric. And we're going to need a couple of 5.5 inch squares. Now, after going through and looking at different parts of the blocks, you could just cut 2 5.5 inch squares. But later on, as we're doing more blocks, you're going to need more of this fabric. So I decided on mine, I'm just going to go ahead, cut a full 5.5 inch times width of fabric. I'll only use 2 of the 5.5 inch squares out of it for this month, but I can label it, put it aside, and we'll use it in months coming up. So that's all the strip cutting that you need to do for that. So I'm just going to take this fabric and put it away. And now we are ready to do the cutting that we need to do. So the first one I'm going to do is that last strip that we just cut. I am going to get rid of the salvage edge. And I'm going to cut just 2 5.5 inch squares. Oops. 5.5, not 5. There we go. Now the rest of this strip can just go back into your stash. I label it 5.5 inches so I don't have to measure it later. I know exactly what it is, and I can get it put away. Now these 5.5 inch squares, while we have them down, we are going to chop those on both diagonals. So line up your ruler, making sure you're right in the corner and the corner. Cut. And line up again on this side. Cut them again. There we go. Now we're going to take these, label them L. Now grab your 4.5 inch strip, and we are going to cut this into 8 4.5 inch squares. Again, let's get rid of that salvage. 2, 4, 8, and we are going to label them J. I'm taking extra special care with the labeling this month because there's a lot of pieces, and also because I'm using different colors. Okay, take this, stick it back in your bag. All right, now let's do the 3 inch strips. We'll leave the 2.5s for just a minute because there's quite a lot of different cutting with the 2.5s. And with the 3 inch strips, we are just going to cut those into 32 3 inch squares. So just go ahead and cut up your 3 inch and make 32 3 inch squares. There we go, that's 32, and we are going to label them A. So these are our A squares. And just take the rest of that, put it back into your stash. And now we are ready to cut up the 2.5s. So we're going to start with 32 2.5-inch squares. Now the 32 2.5-inch squares, we're going to call them C. Put them off to the side. Now we need 32 2.5 by 4.5. So go ahead and cut 32 2.5 by 4.5. And we will label these G, as in George. And if I unfold my strip, I'm going to get one more out of there. There we go. Okay, carry on until you have 32 2.5 by 4.5. Okay, that's 32 2.5 by 4.5, and we're labeling them G. And off they go. Now grab the last of your 2.5-inch strips, and we are now going to cut 16 2.5 by 6.5. Now, this is only a 6-inch ruler, so I am going to swap to my 6.5-inch ruler, so that I don't have to worry about that extra 1/2 inch. But if you don't have a 6.5-inch ruler, remember all you need to do is line it up here and here on the 6 and grab a different ruler and make sure you have that extra 1/2 inch so that you have 6.5 inches. Or you can just turn your ruler this way so that you have 6.5. So when I turn my ruler this way, I just make sure I'm lining up straight here, and I'm on the 6.5, and just trim that way. But I'm just going to switch to my 6.5-inch ruler. There we go. So we're going to label these H, as in Henry. And we're going to put them off to the side. And that is all the cutting for your background. So any of your strips that you have left over, and we have a little bit of 2.5 left over, we can go ahead and put that, label it, put it back into your box, and we will use that later. Okay, now we're going to cut up the indigo. Now, as I said, I am going to use both of my blocks are going to be using this indigo. Now this indigo that I'm using is some leftovers from, I'm not even sure what. I think it might have even actually at one point been a wide back. So it's kind of a weird fabric to deal with. So let me just get this folded. See, I've got bits and pieces cut out of it. It's just a weird piece of fabric. Now, just as an off to the side, when we do have these weird pieces of fabric in our stash, and I am definitely pretty sure this used to be a wide back, how do you tell what was salvage to salvage and where the salvage was? So with this piece of fabric, if you take it and you pull, and it has some stretch like this would have been salvage to salvage. So if I take it and I'm running parallel to the salvage, there's no stretch in this fabric whatsoever. So that would have been where the salvage was. And this way, where there is a little bit of stretch, would have been salvage to salvage. So that's basically how I want to fold this piece of fabric, if I can figure that out, so that I'm still cutting salvage to salvage. Now, is it a big deal if I cut parallel to the salvage? Not really, but it does take all of the give out of the strips that we would normally have when we're piecing. So whenever possible, I still like to cut salvage to salvage. Now what this also means, because I am cutting a weird piece of fabric, it's neither a width of fabric nor is it a fat quarter. My cutting number of strips is going to be a little bit different. But with yours, if you are cutting width of fabric, you are going to need 3 3-inch strips times width of fabric. And then we just need 2 4.5-inch squares. So if you are cutting from fat quarters, you're going to need 6 3-inch width of fabric. And that will be pretty squeaky to get all of those out of one fat quarter, but it can be done as long as it is a true fat quarter and it hasn't been cut down. So for those of you who aren't dealing with a weird piece of fabric like me, cut 3 width of fabric, 3-inch. Let's get that off. Now what I need to do, because I'm cutting weird, is figure out actually how wide this is and then figure how many strips from there. So one strip wide on this is about 26 inches. So I will continue cutting all the strips that I need, and you just need to cut 3. And once you have the correct number of 3-inch strips, now we also need to cut 2 4.5-inch squares. Now, if you're going to be using this fabric later on in the quilt, you might as well just go ahead and cut a 4.5-inch strip, because we can use that later on in the quilt, and that's exactly what I'm going to do, because I will be using this indigo farther along in the quilt, just because I like it so much. And, you know, because I have a pretty big honking piece of it. So from your 4.5-inch strip, we just need 2 4.5-inch squares. I'm going to put the big ruler away now. I don't need that. Grab my smaller ruler. So tidy up your raw edge if you need to. And I do, because they don't match. And now just cut 2 4.5-inch squares. We're going to label these K. There's no further subcutting that needs to be done with these. And then they can go off to the side. Now the 3-inch strips that we cut, we need to cut 32 3-inch squares. Let me just clean up my area a little bit. So again, make sure that your salvage is taken off, or at the very least that your strips, if you're cutting from weird fabric like me, make sure your strips are lined up. And go ahead and cut 32 3-inch squares. And there we go, 32 3-inch squares. We're going to label them B. And we are done with indigo. Okay. So now with the green, now remember I'm going to be doing half peach and half green. Now for the green, you can get away with just doing 1 fat quarter. What we need is 3 strips times width of fabric at 2.5 inches. I'm just cutting up from bits and pieces, again, for this fabric, so I don't have a full fat quarter, but a full fat quarter will work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split it up between the two. I'm going to do half of my cuts from the green and half of my cuts from the peach. So what we need total is, if you're cutting from 1 fabric, and it's width of fabric, you need 3 width of fabric strips. If you're by 2.5. If you are cutting from a fat quarter, you need 6 2.5-inch strips. Now, because I am going to be cutting bits and pieces, not sure how many strips I'm going to need, but if you want to split it up like I'm doing, what we need is a total of 8 2.5-inch squares and 8 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangles from each fabric. So we'll start by cutting some strips. Again, for those of you who are cutting from 1 full or width of fabric, you need 3 2.5-inch wide strips times width of fabric. If you're cutting from a fat quarter, you need 6. There we go. Now I hope I'm not making this too confusing for you. So for the green print, what she's calling green print, we need a total of 16 2.5-inch squares, 8 for each block, and 16 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangles, 8 for each block. So what I have is 8 of 2 different colors. I am still going to label these the same. So this one will be block or piece number D, and this one is going to be piece number F. Even though they're different colors, they are still the same piece number. So I'm going to do D and F. And then I'm going to put them off to the side. And now we are ready to cut up fabric number 15, or what is called aqua floral. And again, I don't think that the aqua floral in the block stands out as much. So I want to go ahead and I want to make darker fabric. And I kind of like this little yellow print. It's got some of my peaches in there, so it's going to kind of go with a lot of the other fabrics that I've chosen. So from this, what we need is 2 width of fabric strips if you're cutting it from full width of fabric. If you're cutting it from a fat quarter, which I am, we are going to need 4 2.5 strips. So again, we're just going to go ahead and clean up that salvage area, or raw edge in this case. And I'm going to cut 4 2.5 and I think actually this fabric needs a bit of a press. It's a little bit foldy. So once I get my strips cut, I'm just going to take it and press it before I cut my squares. Probably should have pressed it before I even cut it in the first place, but it's not too late. I can go and give it a quick press now. So off I go to the ironing board. That's better. Okay. So now what we need from here is 16 2.5 by 4.5 rectangles. So I'm just going to pile a couple of strips up. Cut off that salvage. It's a pretty big salvage on this. Get rid of that. And now we need to cut 16 2.5 by 4.5. Okay, we are going to label these I, as in indigo. Off to the side with them. I can take the rest of that fabric, got a little bit left, and stick it into the bin. You never know, we might be able to use that in another block. Okay, now we are down to the indigo floral. And these are the 2 fabrics that I'm using for my indigo floral. If you are using one fabric and you're using width of fabric, you would need 2 4.5-inch times width of fabric strips. If you're cutting from a fat quarter, you're going to need 4 4.5 times width of fabric. So that will pretty much suck up your whole entire fat quarter. For mine, because I'm using 2 different fat quarters, I will need 2 4.5-inch strips out of each fat quarter. So whichever you're cutting, let's start with that. And again, even though I am using 2 different fat quarters, I'm going to label these the same at the end. I guess when I'm putting my block together, I just want to make sure that I don't get them mixed up. So we're going to cut 2 4.5. Let's make sure I'm not cutting into my next one. 2 4.5. There we go. And if I was just using the 1 fat quarter, I would still have just enough to get everything out of 1 fat quarter. But I'm still going to use 2. That's part of the beauty of this block, is you can really do whatever you want to do with the blocks. The blocks themselves don't have to be identical. And I know that some of you have been posting posts to the Facebook showing your blocks, and you're not making them identical. They're just beautiful. I'm thrilled with all the difference that we're seeing in the blocks. It's kind of neat because pretty much every block of the month that I've done in the last little while, everyone's been working up from a kit. So everyone's blocks were exactly the same. This one is a whole lot of fun because everyone's blocks are completely different. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to subcut all of these into 4.5-inch squares. And we need 16 total, 8 from each pile. So if you're only using one fabric, you need 16 4.5-inch squares. If you're using 2 different fabrics like I am, you need 8 out of each fabric. There's 4. There's my next strip. Okay, there's 8 out of that one. And now I'll get 8 out of this one. Okay, so I have 8 of each, and I'm going to label these J, as in Jasmine. Put them off to the side, and that leaves just one fabric left that we need to cut up. Just clean up my edges here, put the rest of the stuff back in the bin. Now from this fabric, we're going to need a total of 4 5-inch squares. So you could just go ahead and cut one full with the fabric strip for a 5-inch square, because 5 inches is a handy number in the fact that we can always cut it down to 2.5-inch strips later if we need to. But you can, if you only have that special piece of fabric and you've only got enough to get 4 5-inch squares out of, just cut the 5-inch squares. If you have full width of fabric, go ahead, cut a full width of fabric strip. And if you're on a fat quarter, well, one 5-inch strip is probably going to do you for your total of 4 5-inch squares. So now that we've cut these squares, we are going to take them and we are going to cut them on one diagonal only. So make sure you're lined up tip to tip, and go ahead, cut those on one diagonal, and then we are going to take these and label them M. So you should have a total of 8 triangles, like so. And we're going to call them M. And then that is all the cutting done, and we are actually ready to start doing the piecing. So because we have quite a lot of pieces on this one, look at that pin. I keep pulling that pin out. That pin's got to go. He's too short. Let's try this one. There we go. I'm going to take all my pieces and I'm going to put them in alphabetical order because that helps. So I've got my A's. Can you even see that? I think this is probably off camera. A, B, C, E, F, H, I, J, K, L, M. Oh, apparently I can't do the alphabet because I missed G. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M. That will just help me keep track of the blocks and what I'm using. So now we're ready to start piecing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our 32 A's and our 32 B's, and we are going to make a whole pile of half square triangles. So we're going to start by putting the A and the B right sides together, and we're going to draw a line on the lighter of the two right here. Let me find a marker that will show up on the camera. And we're going to draw a line from one corner to the other corner, like this. And then you are going to sew 1/4 of an inch on each side of that line. So you're going to sew 1/4 of an inch down here and 1/4 of an inch down here. We've made lots of these half square triangles. This isn't going to be a whole lot different. And we need to make 32 of them. So that's a whole pile of half square triangles. Now when you're sewing down here, as I always suggest, it is helpful if you scant up your 1/4 inch, because we are going to be squaring these up, and it just gives us a little bit more wiggle room if we have this scanted. And when I say scant, I don't mean super tiny. I just mean 1 thread or 2 threads narrower than 1/4 of an inch. So that is the first step. We're going to spend some time at the sewing machine, and we're going to make 32, pair these together, and make 32 little blocks. So off to the sewing machine. And back from the sewing machine. So now what we're going to do is, first we're going to cut all of these apart, if you chain pieced. And then what we'll do is cut on the line that you had drawn. And it doesn't matter if you use your rotary cutter or if you use scissors, whatever you prefer, but cut them in half, and then we're off to the ironing board, and we're going to press everything towards the darker fabric or the B block. So everything will get pressed this way, like so. So that's our jobs. We're going to spend some quality time at the ironing board, and then we're going to spend even more quality time squaring these little dickenses up. So finish cutting them apart, and then cut them on the line that you drew, and then off to the ironing board. And we are back from the ironing board, and now we are going to square up all 2,968,000 of these half square triangles. And it's actually not that bad. It just looks like a lot. So of course, how we square them up is you get a ruler that has the diagonal going directly into the corner. It always works the best with one of those. And you line that diagonal up directly on the diagonal line right here that you've sewn in between your 2 half square triangles. And on the first cut, we want to make sure we're bigger than 2.5 all the way around. There's my 2.5 there, and my 2.5 there, and I'm bigger all the way around. And we cut, and we cut, and then we flip this around, line it up on the diagonal again, and then definitely on the 2.5 and 2.5 directly on top of that now, because that is the finished size that we want our half square triangle to be. And there we go. Let's do that again. Line it up directly on the line. So I'm on my diagonal. I'm bigger than 2.5 all the way around. Cut, cut. Turn it around, line it up directly on the diagonal again, and this time I'm directly on my 2.5 and my 2.5. And cut, and cut. And there we go. So continue doing that to this big pile of happiness here. So we're spending some quality time at the cutting board. And then we'll be back to do the next units. Still trimming. There we go. All done. And that's actually not much coming off of 2 million blocks. There we go. Into the trash can. Okay, so now we are ready to do our next unit. So the next part of this block, we want to grab some of our C squares, and we are going to need 8 of them. Okay, and we are going to take a C, and we are going to sew it to the top of 8 of the triangle units we just made. Now you want to make sure that the triangle is going in the correct direction. We don't want to get them going this way. We want them going this way, like so. And we're going to make a total of 8 of those. So that's our next step. Off to the sewing machine. Remember to put yourself back into a 1/4 inch. We don't want to scant up anymore. If you did scant up to make your half square triangles, and make 8 of these. So off to the sewing machine, and we are back. So now we're going to head over to the ironing board and we are going to press all of these towards the C block. So we want to press this up away from the half square triangle. So that's our next job. Cut these all apart and then off to the ironing board. So here we are back from the ironing board. Now just before we tuck these units away, we should give them a quick measure. We want to make sure that they measure 2.5 by 4.5. If I need to make adjustments to my 1/4 inch, now is the time to do it. But everything is looking good, 2.5 by 4.5. Now we can put those away and make the next unit. And we can just take these little guys and set them off to the side for now, because we are now going to make our next unit. And the next unit consists of 8 more of your C blocks. 8. And we also want to use our D blocks. Now, if you are doing all one color, then you're going to use 8 Ds. If you're doing 2 colors, 2 different colors like I am, you want to do 4 of one color and 4 of the other color. And we are going to make another block. So this time, we're going to sew the C's to the left-hand side of the block and your D's to the right-hand side of the block. And it's important that you get the orientation correct. The last ones we did, they were this way. When we did the C, we wanted to make sure that the triangle was going that way. Now on this particular one, when we put these together, we want to make sure the triangle is going in the opposite direction. So make sure you line these up properly. And we are going to make 8 of these. Like so. So back to the sewing machine. Okay, so here we are back from the sewing machine. And we have just made this unit right here. So we're going to take this to the ironing board and we're going to press all the seam allowances up towards this square here. So up towards the C square. So we're going to go this way and press everything in one direction. So that is our next job. Off to the ironing board. And that will give us 2 different units. So we have unit 1 right here, because all these units go in to make the corner block. So we have unit 1. This we're going to call unit 2. And then we'll be making a 3 and a 4. So off to the ironing board, and then we'll be back to the sewing machine. Here we are back from the ironing board. We have units 1 and 2. And now we are going to make unit 3 out of just the half square triangles. And again, we want to watch the placement of the half square triangle. We want it to go this way. And we're going to put 3 of them together like this. Like so. So what we want to do is make 8 with the triangle going in this direction right here. So that is our next step. Off to the sewing machine. 8 of these. And we are back. Now all of these units, when you're looking at them like this with the dark triangle pointing down to the left, we want to press them all in this direction. So everything should be going towards the bottom of the unit. So that's our next step. Off to the ironing board. Everything towards the bottom of the unit. There we go. That is unit number 3 of this block. So now we are going to take the rest of our half square triangles and we are going to make another unit, but this time we want the dark going in the other direction. So we want it to look like this time, and we're going to put 3 of them together. Same as we did before, putting 3 of those together, and then we are going to add on the last of our D squares. So we'll have a total of 8 of these, and a D square will be on the bottom end, right down here. So that'll be our next step. Put these 3 together with a D on the bottom. And again, if you are doing 2 different colors, make sure that you do 4 of one and 4 of the other. So back to the sewing machine. Back from the sewing machine, and all of these are going to get pressed towards the D square. So take everything, press it this way, and then that is actually all the units ready, and we can assemble the corner blocks now. So off to the sewing ironing board. Back from the ironing board, and after all that carefulness, I still got one wrong. So out comes Rita the Ripper, and I will be right back. Okay, now to complete this unit, what we want to do is grab our E squares, which were the 4.5 of background, and we're going to build this unit like so. So we're going to start with a 1 and a 2, and we want them to go together like that. So we're going to take a 4.5, and we're going to sew this together, and then we're going to sew this on the bottom. And you want to make sure that the blue squares are pointing in towards one another. Okay, and we're going to do 8 of these. So we're going to do this in a couple of different steps because it's a fairly big unit. So take your E squares, put the first unit we made on the right hand side, put the second unit we made on the bottom. So you'll sew this together and then sew that onto that. And back to the sewing machine. Now just before I sew the bottom part onto here, I am going to take these to the ironing board and I'm going to press them all towards the pieced unit right here. So press all your seam allowances that away, and then we can put the bottom on. And we're back. So now we're going to take this unit and press this up. So the seam allowance is going this way, up towards here. That's the next step. Back to the ironing board. There we go. Now back from the ironing board, and now before we go any further, it would be a good time to double check and see if we needed to do any squaring up. These blocks should be 6.5 inches square. And if they are, excellent. If not, give them a little trim and square them up to 6.5. And now we are ready to put on the rest of the side. So we're going to do that and there. Oop, not that one. This one. Okay, so basically what you're doing is the exact same thing, only we're using the bigger block now. So you're going to sew this one on first, and then we are going to go ahead and press again towards this right here. And then you'll go ahead and put this one on, and this we are going to press towards, this time, towards this one. So it'll be sew it on, press, sew it on, press. So back to the sewing machine. And if you did do the different colors like I've done on mine, make sure that you don't get them mixed up. You want to make sure you keep your colors the same. Back to the sewing machine. There we go. Those are the corner blocks done. I'm just going to head over to the ironing board, give them all a press, and then we can start on the next units. Okay, take all of these unit 1s, put them off to the side. We are done with them for now. So our next unit is a new unit we've never done before. This is an elongated flying goose. So it looks like a goose in the center, but then it's got kind of some extra spread wings. So for this we're going to need our F and our G, and we're going to be making 16 of these. So the first thing you do is you take an F, or the colored block in this case, and put a G so that they're forming a corner like this. And then we are going to draw a line from this corner to this corner. So you want to make sure, I'm just going to move that over a little bit so you can see. I want to go right from this corner to this corner with my line. Like so. And then I'm going to line that up with the raw edge of my fabric. And then we're going to sew on there, and then when we flip it over, right, you can see you've kind of got the left edge of a goose started. Okay, so draw your lines, and to draw the lines you may have to just put the fabric on top of the darker piece just so you can see where the two corners need to be, and then go ahead and line up the raw edges and sew directly on top of that line. So let's do that again. Right sides together, like so. Draw the line directly from corner to corner, like that. And I can just see where the corner needs to be just because my fabric is a little darker than my background. If you can't see your background, through your background, just move it over so that it gives you a place to aim for, and then slide it up. Line up your raw edges and sew directly on top of this line. So we're going to do that to 16 units. And of course, if you've got two different, like me, you're going to have 8 and 8. So grab all of these and off to the sewing machine. Now that was a little bit tricky, something we haven't really done before. I mean, we've made lots of geese, but with the elongated goose, you want to make sure that you have that correct so that this is going to go in this direction. It's pretty easy to put them on backwards. So double check them all, make sure that you have the goose kind of going this way, and then if you've done that, we can trim this extra off, line it up on the 1/4 inch of your ruler, so the 1/4 inch on the line that you sewed, and cut. But check them before you cut, just to be sure, because I put a couple of them on the incorrect way, so we want to make sure that we don't do that. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to press towards the background. So we want to press away from the actual goose before we put the next side on. Because once we've pressed, what we'll do is put this next side on so that our goose is going to look like this. And it's called elongated, of course, because it's a goose with big long wings. So for now, double check to make sure that you have this correct first. Then go ahead, trim that off to the ironing board, and we want to press towards the background. So that's a lot all in one. But quite easy to do a quick check. That was one of the ones I actually sewed on backwards. There we go. Okay, so check. Once you're good, trim off to the ironing board. That is your next step. Okay, back from the ironing board, and now we are ready to complete our elongated goose. So we're going to do the same thing here. Make sure it's right sides together. And now we are going to draw a line from here to here. And again, if you can't see, just pull that out so that you can see tip to tip, and draw your line. And then line your raw edges up like so. Make sure again that you're going in the right direction, because the goal is to have something that looks like this. This is actually a really cool block. Okay, we haven't done it before, so it's kind of cool. All right, so go ahead, that's the next step. Grab all of those, right sides together, line up your raw edges, and sew from here to here. And yes, you should have that little bit of overlap, the same as on a regular goose. So, back to the sewing machine. And here we are back from the sewing machine. So same thing again, once you have confirmed that you have them on correctly and you have a block that looks like this, where this is the one we just sewed on, it'll flip back. Once you've confirmed that, we're going to cut that down to 1/4 inch, so line up your ruler on the line 1/4 inch of the ruler on the line that you sewed. Trim the rest. And then we are off to the ironing board, and we're going to press that towards the wing. So away from the colored. So that's our next step. Cut them apart. Trim them down once you've confirmed that it's good. And then off to the ironing board. It's like playing with a row of flags. There we are, back from the ironing board. Now these blocks should measure 2.5 by 8.5. And if they don't, then we need to trim them up if they're a little bit too big. And maybe go back to the ironing board if they're a wee bit too small, and just see if we can iron that out. Now that one's fine. But check to make sure you have the right size, and they should be 2.5 by 8.5. Okay, now we are ready to move on to the next step. Now we can just for a second put those off to the side, and we want to grab our H's and our I's. And we're going to do another cool little block that's a little bit different than what we've done before. So you want to lay your eye down like so, And right sides together, put an H on the side. And we're going to do the same as what we just did. Draw a line. And then we're going to sew directly on top of that line. Right there, we're going to sew on that line. And when we flip that open, it's kind of similar to what we just did. We're making an elongated goose, although this is like a wonky goose. But we'll do the elongated part first. So make sure you are on the right-hand side of I, and you're going from the top left to the bottom right, and go ahead and sew all of those on. And we only need 8 of these. Yes, we only need 8. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, off to the sewing machine. All right, back from the sewing machine. Now we're going to go ahead and cut them apart. And what you should have are blocks that look like this. So we're going to go ahead, and as long as that's what you've got, cut here 1/4 inch away, go ahead and press, and we're going to press again towards the white. So that's the next step. Cut, press, and then we'll put the next side on. And it's not what you think. Okay, back from the ironing board. Now this time we are actually going to grab some C's, and that is going to be the other wing. So we're going to line that up, and we're going to sew from this corner to this corner. So we're going to have a block that looks like that. And we're going to make 8 of them. So all of these get this. So it's kind of like a goose with a clipped wing. So if this goose is doing any flying, he's going to be flying around in a circle. Okay, so take these 8 units off to the sewing machine and clip that goose's wing. Okay, back from the sewing machine with our little clipped wings. So if all is well, and you have a block that looks like this, then go ahead, cut that off, leaving yourself the 1/4 inch, and then go ahead and press that with the seam allowance going towards the white, or your background, whatever your background is. Okay, next step, off we go. Okay, there we are, back from the ironing board. Now these units should also measure 2.5 by 8.5, and mine do, but if yours don't, make adjustments that you need to, and we'll stick those off to the side. And now we are going to do exactly the same thing, but on the left-hand side. So you want to take your I and an H, right sides together, and this time we're going to be going in this direction right here, so that we will have the long wing over on the left-hand side. So that is your next job, and we have 8 of them. Sew off to the sewing machine, and if you need to, of course, draw the lines to make it a little bit easier to know what you need to line up with. Like so. There we go. So, off to the sewing machine. Back from the sewing machine. Just break apart a couple of those. Check to make sure that you are good. And you have that going out towards the left if all is well. Trim this off 1/4 inch from the stitch line. Press towards the white, or your background, whatever your background is. That's the next step. Go ahead and get that done. And then we will put the other side on our goose. There we are, back from the ironing board, and now you're going to go ahead and put the last of the C's right there, and make sure that you sew from top left to bottom right, And this is what we're going for. Okay, so back to the sewing machine. Draw your line from here to here and sew on that line to all 8 of these. And we're back. There we go. If all is well, press this over. If it's all good, cut, press, and press towards the background. Okay, off to the ironing board. Okay, now we're ready to do some assembly. I believe we have all our bits and pieces ready. Okay, so we're going to start with taking in the original elongated goose that we had made. And we're kind of making a 4 patch out of these. And then we want one of these on the left and one of these on the right. This is a pretty cool block. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to sew these together. So I think it would be the easiest to sew these 2 together first and then one on each end, as opposed to sewing these 2 together and these 2 together. I might be wrong though. Let me see. Yeah, I still think I'm going to go with that. So I'm going to sew these 2 together. We've sewn geese together before, where we want to make sure that we line up the points. So you can use the pin, where you stick a pin through right there at the peak and a pin through right here at the peak. Leave that pin perpendicular. Even if it is a little bit bent, leave it perpendicular and put a pin down either side. And that'll hold that area and stop it from sliding around. And then you can take out the perpendicular pin, and since it's bent, it can go into the dead needle file. And then go ahead and line up the long edges. Okay? And you're going to sew 8 of these together. So keep in mind, remember, if you're doing 2, right, you're going to do 4 with the one color and 4 with the other color. So go ahead and sew all your geese together, and then we will put the sides on. So back to the sewing machine. There we go. Now we're going to take these units, and this is a pretty seamy little area right in here, so we're going to press this seam open. So grab all of these, right where those points meet right there. That's pretty seamy. So press these seams open, and then we can put these on the other sides. So off to the ironing board. There we are, back from the ironing board. And I know quite often pressing seams open is a little bit fiddly, but there are some times where it's just absolutely necessary, and this is just one of those times because that's a really thick seam right there. Okay, now we're going to take one of these and put it on the left-hand side, and one of these and put it on the right-hand side. And you want to make sure that these are pointing towards the top of the block. Okay, and when you are lining these up, what you want to do is line it up so that 1/4 inch down, these are going to line up. So if you line up this line of your goose with this line of your goose, that should do it. And it's not opposing seams, so it'll get a little bit seamy in there. And on this side, same thing. You want to line up this seam right here with this seam right here. And make sure they're lined up right on top of one another, so when you do your 1/4 inch, they will meet. That is the goal. Okay, so go ahead and do that on all of these. So we want a left and a right on all of these. So back to the sewing machine. There we go. That wasn't so bad. They actually line up pretty easily. Now we're going to go ahead and press towards the 2 outer blocks. So we're going to press this direction right here. So off to the ironing board. Now, just when you think you're done with this block, you are not. Okay, we're going to grab our J's, and they are going to go down in the corners. And what we're actually going to do is make a block that looks like that. So this is a very, very interesting block. And if you have two different centers and you're using two different of these, just make sure you don't get them mixed up. So the easiest thing to do is grab this, draw a line on the back, like we usually do on one diagonal. Like so. Line that up in the bottom left-hand corner of all of these blocks. And make sure you are in the bottom. You're not, this is considered the top. We want to be in the bottom. And then you're just going to sew from here to there. And you're going to do that with all 8 of your blocks. We just, if you're doing 2 different ones like I am, you want to make sure you don't get your pieces mixed up. So these ones are going to belong to this block, these ones belong to this block. Or vice versa. Let me see which ones I like better. Do I like that better? Or do I like this one better? I think on this block where I have the peach, I actually like this one better in the corner. And this one, where I have the green, I like this one better. So on mine, those are going to have that one, and this block is going to have this one. Now, we're only going to do the left-hand corner for now. So off to the sewing machine, draw a line on the back, off to the sewing machine, sew it on the bottom left-hand corner. And we're back. So now we're going to go ahead, and that's what we're looking for. We want to cut off that excess, and then we're going to go ahead and press towards the corner. Okay, so cut off that excess, line up on your 1/4 inch, and press. Okay, do that to all 8 of these. I'm going to get a little bit bigger ruler for this. Okay. Line up on the 1/4. Cut. Now these are big enough that you could save them for something else if you wanted to. You never know when those cutoffs are going to come in handy, like last month when they actually became block number 18. I don't know if we need to be saving them for anything else at this point. So you can do whatever it is you want. There we are. Go ahead, press those over, and then we'll be back to put the next piece on. Okay, the next step, we are going to go ahead and put the right-hand side on. I want to make sure I don't get them mixed up. There we go, and we're going to line this up this way, like so. So on top of the line, so that our block will look like this. Now that's very clever. It's kind of a very detailed, intricate looking block, and it's not really that bad to put together. So off to the sewing machine. And then the only unit we have left to make after this is the center unit. So we're almost there. Back we are again. All right, same thing. If all is well, trim off that excess. And then we're off to the ironing board and we're going to press that over. So make sure, especially at this point with all the work we've put into this block, that you're 1/4 inch away from the line. Don't cut right on the line because that would be really sad. Go ahead, do all of these. Because like I said, then after we get this finished, all we have left is the center block to do. And the center block is a square in a square in a square. So another pretty cool block. We've done square in a square before, but we haven't done square in a square in a square. So that's just too much fun. All right, 2 more to trim off, and then off to the ironing board. There we go. Okay, off to the ironing board. Back from the ironing board. And how about this? Now, how's this for a happy little coincidence? Nothing that I actually planned, but the dots on this are all lined up pretty much perfectly on all of them. There's just one where the dots are a little bit skewed. This one right here, and it doesn't even really look all that bad. So that was a little happy coincidence. I didn't actually plan for that. Didn't really even think about it a whole lot. Okay, now we can take all of these units and they can now go off to the side, and we are ready to use our K, L, and M blocks. So that's our next step. Grab the last 3 pieces. All right, now we are ready for the center blocks. So you're going to take your piece K, and we are going to make a square in a square. Now, anytime that we have made a square in a square in the past, we have done it with squares, where we put a square in the corner, we sewed across, and then we flipped it over. Here, we are actually doing it with a little bit different way. First of all, we're using triangles, and secondly, we're not actually putting it in the corner and then flipping it over. We are going to lay them right sides down on the square. Now, what you should have is equal amounts sticking out at each end, and if it helps, you can find 2 1/4. You can find the center of the block. That's not really going to show up very well, is it? Let me do it with my white, if that is handy. I'll just grab a piece of white just to show you. So if you want to find center, you can just do 2 1/4, 2 1/4, and that's the center of the block right there. So when you're laying these down, you want them to go right sides together, and the point should be pointing right in the center of the block. So right down there. And like when we do square in a square with squares in the corner, we can do opposite sides of this block at the same time, but we cannot do the next piece until this is sewn on and pressed. So go ahead and you can do both sides of the block, lining it up so that this point is in the center of the block, like so. And we're going to do that to 2 of them. So grab your triangles, off to the sewing machine. We're going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Off to the sewing machine. Okay, now we're going to head over to the ironing board and we're going to press these towards the corner. So we want to press it towards this fabric right here. Next 2 corners. Grab this, right side down. Again, you want to line that up with equal sticking out across here, and you're going to sew all the way across. And you will do that with both sides. Line that up. Have equal sticking out at both edges. Sew all the way across with a 1/4 inch seam. And do that on both of these. There we go. Off to the ironing board. Press these both towards the outer square. Or outer triangle, I guess it's not a square. Back from the ironing board. Now if these little dog ears bug you, you can cut them off. But there's no particular reason to cut them off or to keep them. And now we're going to take our final piece and we are going to repeat what we just did, making our square in a square in a square. So line those up, equal sticking out on each edge, sew across 1/4 inch seam, 1/4 inch seam, and then we'll come back and we'll press. So off to the sewing machine. there we go with our first two pieces back from the sewing machine. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but we're dealing with two completely different triangles here. When we cut these ones, we cut a square and then we cut it on both diagonals. So what that leaves is this part that was right here was the straight of grain, and this part is the little bit biasy, right, on that triangle. When we did this one, we cut a big square and just cut it on half one diagonal. So this is our bias seam, and that leaves us with straight grain on the outside. Most of the time, when we are dealing with triangles, we want to cut them so once they're sewn into the block, straight of grain is on the outside of the triangle, which is this case right here. And in this one, the straight of grain was here, leaving us with a little bit of a bias edge there. And because we are doing square in a square in a square, that actually works. Okay, off to the sewing machine, off to the ironing board. Press towards the triangle. Now, let's go ahead and put those last two triangles on this side. And when you line it up, you should have equal sticking out. And generally, where these two intersect, that would be where your 1/4 inch is. And we'll put those on each end, here and here, and of course here and here. So back to the sewing machine. There we go. Okay, over to the ironing board. We're going to give this a final press, and then there we go. Now before we go on to our final assembly of the block, we should probably square these up, and they should square up to 8.5. And I am just a little tiny bit oversized on a couple of the edges. So what's important when you're squaring up a block like this is to make sure that you maintain your 1/4 inch. We don't want to lose our 1/4 inch here, or we're going to lose our points, and we don't want that to happen. So when I am lining up to square a block like this up, the first thing I want to do is I want to look at that diagonal, and I want that diagonal to go right straight through the center of my block. I don't want it to be like this or to be off center. So I line that up on the center, and then I check to make sure that I'm a 1/4 inch from the tip to the edge on these two. So I'm a 1/4 from here to here and a 1/4 from here to here. I am lined up center, and I'm going right through the center of the block. So I can just go ahead, and most of what I'm nipping off here is just those little doggy ears. Just taking off like little nubbins. Turn it around, do the same thing. I'm lining it up on 8.5, 8.5. I want to make sure I'm going through the center, that I have my 1/4 inch here and my 1/4 inch here, and go ahead and trim that down. And again, I'm really just taking off the dog ears. There's one. Go through this again. Line it up. I want to make sure I have my 1/4 inch and my 1/4 inch. I'm going through the center. Make sure I have my 1/4 inch here and here. There we go. Okay, so now we are ready to assemble the block. And again, this being a 24-inch block, I can't really get the whole thing on the camera, but we'll be able to get most of it. So we want to start with this one. And then we're going to do this one. Let's get everything out of the way. And we want one of those on each side, because that is our star points. And of course, I got to make sure that I have the right ones. There we go. Like that. And then move this out of the way. These go into the corners like so. where's my other green one? There he is. Very pretty. Okay, so as usual, we're going to sew these three together, these three together, these three together, and then we'll do some pressing before we do the final seams. So we'll start with these three. Off to the sewing machine. There we go. Now we're going to press these seams that way, these seams this way, and these two seams that way. And then we're ready to put the block together like this. So off to the ironing board. There we are. One done. Off to the second one now. Okay, same thing. Sew those together, those together, those together. Press the seam allowances out, in, out. And then we're done for this month. And here is number 2. And I am pleased with both of those. So that finishes off this month. Next month, we are going to do blocks 2 and 14. So block number 2 is the last of the 24-inch blocks. And blocks number 14 are these blocks right here. And they are another, oh, those are an 8-inch block this time. So next month we are doing 2 more sets, blocks 2 and block number 14. So the last of the 24s and the first of the 8s. So that is it for this month. We are done. And again, just think, you have now done another 8 square feet of your quilt. So that's exciting. Okay, so that's it for now. Everyone have an absolutely amazing month, and I hope to see you on the Zoom call. Any questions, let me know. Bye for now. Happy sewing.